welcome to tonight's We'll Talk with Artists. My name is Martha Campbell, and I'm MFA's Communications Manager. Our digital discussion tonight is with sculptor Frances Vye Wilson. Frances is developing a whole new medium based around the inner bark of the Asian mulberry tree, a pliable yet firm base for her to build female figures as kinds of metaphors for the life, fight, and social roles of women. I would also like to introduce the host of our show, Wil Scott. Wil is an art historian with an extensive career as a photographer and the former head of adult programs for the National Gallery of Art. He is uniquely qualified to help bridge the gap between artists and the public, and he'll be our guide into the art world tonight.
Well, thank you, Martha, for taking care of us again tonight and for your introduction. And Frances, thank you for agreeing to subject yourself to this trial.
What? Oh, no. That's not fair. You've lured me in.
I'm sure that we'll have an enjoyable evening, you and I hope everybody else will too. Your work is, I think, really strong and very fascinating. It, of course, attracted my attention in our exhibits and from your website because it is so beautiful. And I think you're very unusual, perhaps unique, medium is also something that we want to talk about because being possibly unique, at least in this area, I don't understand it, and it is a fundamental part of what you're doing as an artist. So why don't we start, as we conventionally do, by having you tell us just a little bit about yourself, because I know that this medium is relatively new to you, and you weren't always a studio artist.
No, I have not been a studio artist for more than 7 years, I guess, but I was raised and grew up in a very strong visual family. My mother had a passion for beautiful fibers and fabrics, and my stepfather's a very, very talented, successful artist, an aunt who's a well-known artist, and an uncle, an architect, and it goes on from there. So I really had strong influences from my family. And I moved to New York in the 80s and was involved in film and television, again, a highly visual world. But at a certain point, it was time to really address the artistic side of things. So I had studied ikebana, which is Japanese floral design, and with the very young organization of 500 years called Suketsu. And Suketsu encourages more independent creative work. So they do the very large installations and more graphic and lots of branch material. So branch material still figures very strongly in my work because I have a strong passion for plant material. And so you'll see that thread running through all of my work. But to make it a very short story, I chipped my foot and decided that I needed to find a material to work with to actually create some very large containers for my ikebana work, because I had exhibited at the Metropolitan Museum a couple of times and I really had to up my game because it was another world. But in the process of doing that, I imported a lot of different papers, and not knowing what I was ordering, I got this little bundle. And when I opened it up, I discovered this. I actually have some right here to show you. This incredible fiber was just in a little bundle. Can you see this?
Yeah.
And when I opened it, I realized that it was incredibly strong. And they actually make rope from it, as well as wrapping opium in Laos. And you can see when you pull on it this way that it's extremely porous. So in the process of hardening it, it gets wet and I can stretch it out. But the material took me a long time to find, about 2 years to find in this size. And eventually I did locate an exporter in Lao Prabang in Laos. And that's a wonderful story about the small family collectives that harvest this from the mulberry tree. I guess we're already into that.
Yeah.
I've segued into something else here.
Well,
but-
Frances, yes, and since we are beginning to segue, let me interrupt just for a second and ask a couple of things. First of all, as a point of reference for all of us, is it anything like in texture and its characteristics to more familiar materials to us, like hemp or sisal?
I guess hemp, you're right, although I'm not sure that hemp is ever processed in these sheets. So what this is the early stage of the pulp and paper business in Thailand. So I get this before it's put on boats and sent down the Mekong to Thailand to be made into paper. So commonly you see mulberry paper in paper stores. It's quite coarse.
Yes.
Sometimes it's embedded with flowers or plant material.
Yeah. Yeah.
That is
Oh,
further on down the process.
That's a good reference point then, I think, especially for a group of people interested in the arts, because I was trying to think of something that I might have handled or most of our viewers might have handled. So that's a good reference point. Now, a couple of other things that one of them I had made a note of before, because on your website, it mentions these exhibits at the Metropolitan Museum. And that's such a august institution. You exhibited your Ikebana work, and what kind of exhibit? What was the context?
Well, the Asian wing, twice a year, features Ikebana artists from, principally the New York area.
Mm-hmm.
So people will go and there'll be maybe 8 Ikebana artists that will do their display, and it will be in the Asian reading room for a period of time. So that was the context. So no, it wasn't on a grand scale, but it was there.
Yes, exactly. Oh, I always put on my resume that I have spoken at the Metropolitan
There
Museum.
you go.
So don't ignore that.
Not. You
Yes,
cannot
exactly.
put it in.
Now, another thing that I want to ask you about your previous life, if you will, is who's the most famous person you met working in TV and theater?
Well, the one everyone knows. I mean, Sam Shepard, Martha Stewart. Is that your reference?
Well, that's great. And if you're you're having some kind of success in that career, you were there doing that for a while, meeting people like Martha Stewart. Why did you decide to transition out of that? Away from that work?
It's a really good question, except when you're doing something that's not particularly satisfying, I think eventually you just have to pull the plug and take the risk. And so all of these things that came my way were wonderful, but they weren't satisfying. So I was Martha Stewart's stand-in for many years. I was her aunt. But that, yes, it's fun, but it's not very gratifying.
Yeah.
So,
well, I'm glad you found your studio and your medium,
yes.
and that you've made the progress that you have. Now, you also have mentioned that your family is Scottish, and that that plays some part in shaping you as a person and as an artist. So why don't we go ahead and start looking at slides and look at the slide that illustrates that, and then we'll continue on our conversation. We actually have a kilt maker in the audience.
Oh my gosh. Well, what I was referring to in particular with reference Scottish was my father was in the Black Watch, Scottish Regiment, the Black Watch. And I realized when I started the Social Warrior series that his uniforms, I was hugely influenced by all of this regalia, the totems that he wore. And he wore the kilt. He wore everything but the busby, which is the hat. He didn't play the drums or the bagpipe, but you get an idea, you get a flavor in this photo of the very dramatic costuming, really. And it did make me question what is a warrior? What is how are you protected when you're it's simply wool fibers and metals. And what is the notion of a warrior, and what is a warrior now?
And when was this question coming to mind? When you were a child, when you were a teenager, more recently?
No. In fact, I don't know if you can't see at the moment behind me. There is a red torso that kind of began this series. And the truth is, my father had passed away quite recently when I began that, and I wasn't really even aware that was a big part of the influence in that, was just my thinking about him, and that he was a warrior, but he was
saw
just
combat.
So not a warrior.
He was literally in combat, literally a warrior.
He was absolutely in the Black Watch for 25 years. I don't remember exactly the number, but yes, he was in Vietnam. He was in Cyprus. So as a child, he would be absent for periods of time. And
that certainly resonates, I think, with me, and probably with others in our audience. That's the kind of thing that's very fundamental to who you are as a person. And now you've found a way that you can express that in some respect through your art. So why don't we go ahead and look at the next slide, which I believe is from your Heroes series.
Yes, this is the Warriors. The Warriors Call to Arms. This is almost a self-portrait, because when I started to work with this root, I realized that so often my mind is like this root, going off in so many different directions and multiple interests, that, as I say, this root became sort of a self-portrait. But the notion of being curious, and curiosity, imagination, creativity, those things are all so vitally important. And to try to encourage the notion of curiosity and what it means to be curious is very much like the other warriors, whose titles are things like Find the Courage and Speak Up and Worth Fighting For. They're all notions of things we can do to address whatever the issues are that are important to us, but maybe they're just small motivators that, but that is certainly probably one of the most important things I think someone can be, is curious.
I would agree with you on that without any reservation, but what you're talking about now is something that I think, as a artist and as an art historian at the same time, is that we often talk about an artist's intentions, and we can get hung up on the idea, the artist can get hung up on, this means this, and every member of my audience has to recognize it, or the majority, for me to consider myself successful. But we all know, at least after some time of exhibiting our work, that you have no idea what people are going to think and feel when they look at your work. So my question is, how do you think you communicate being curious through this piece?
That's a really good question. I think because there's not a head on this, obviously. So this root becomes the mind, and perhaps someone can look at that and feel that same thing I feel, that my mind just spreads itself out. But maybe it's just a curiosity, and that's fine too. But I hope that the title Be Curious might be just a slight hint. I never want to actually spell something out. But I think it might be a hint to that. And the call to arms is also, to be diligent, to what are those innate strengths that we have that we can harness?
Well, I think, Frances, that this is part of what makes your art challenging and interesting, because calling them social warriors takes it, to me, off the battlefield, but not necessarily away from conflict and
Right.
violence. But the be curious is really the fundamental thing that makes me think, well, what does this mean? And I may not read it exactly as you did in the creation, but I think you've set a path, you've opened a path that we can follow together. But I have another question related to this piece that I want to ask you. When someone of my age, particularly a male, hears the word warrior, I know there have been female warriors in history, and there certainly are female warriors now, but I still think of masculine images.
Right.
To me, this is not really masculine or feminine. How do you respond to that observation? You can tell me it's full of you know what, but
I tried very hard to make these somewhat androgynous, because to me, the message wasn't directed towards males or females. It's really a human message.
Mhm.
So I didn't want that to add to any confusion.
Yeah.
So it's very intentional that it can be read either way. What is amusing is I've been in a gallery where people are looking at it, and the men will inevitably say it's a male warrior, and the women will say it's a female warrior. And if I ask the question, I get exactly the same response. So I think people will project themselves onto the pieces. I hope they do in some way, because then I'm not trying to deliver a message. I'm really not. But if I can encourage anyone in this area, we have new battlegrounds. We are warriors. So every one of us has something we care enough about to feel that strength, I hope.
Well, I think you've issued the challenge, and I hope that the audience is thinking about it and what we've just been talking about. But let's go on to the next image, because your work really is fascinating. And I wonder if you can just say a little bit more while we're looking at this one about the process. Exactly what is it that happens between the arrival of the material and then the finished product that we see here?
Right. Well, I've been using a lot of natural plant dyes, and I don't know if you can see behind me, but there's some bright orange that is hanging up there because I'm starting to work on a wall hanging. But this piece in particular, I began when we were in Florida. We had a place that looked out onto the water, and I was trying to capture that color and sense of the water, of the waves, and it evolved into Poseidon, because I don't know if you're familiar with that area, but the Okeechobee is very close by, and they release filthy water from the sugar plantations right out into the ocean. And I could literally see the color turn brown for this enormous swath of water. And it's very disturbing. And it was also a time of discussion about plastics in the water and what we were doing. And as a pescatarian, the quality of what we eat. So the idea of Poseidon and how angry he would be if he knew what we were doing to the ocean. So without trying to be too much of an environmentalist, the coral is obviously there to reinforce the idea of the sea, but it's also there as a dramatic
it's a wonderful touch to me. But I was going to ask if it was coral or whether it was vegetal. And when one sees the actual piece in person, can the average person identify that as coral? And does that matter to you?
Oh, yes, I think they can identify it as coral. It's simple fan coral that I believe is raised for fish tanks, that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
So, perhaps it resonates with people, but clearly it's something that is from the ocean, and you can see that at the tips of it, it's quite dried out.
Yeah.
And I've preserved it that way because to me, that was emblematic of what was happening in in our oceans. So,
And my final question before we move on to the next piece is,
yes.
because it's clear that this is approximating or reproducing roughly the human torso, how do you stiffen it to retain the shape that you've given it?
I use, well, you can actually see if you look around the waist, the lower waist, that's the material without the hardener.
Oh,
So
okay.
that the body of the piece, which I did try to beef up, by the way, to make it a little more masculine, being Poseidon and all. That is, I use a hardener, but I've been experimenting over the years with hardeners, fabric hardeners that I've added stone dust and marble dust and things to, in fact, give it even more resilience. If you, and you maybe experienced this when the piece was in the gallery, but if you tap on it, it's very strong, very light, but it's very strong. And all through there is a metallic pigment that I added to the fiber when I was dyeing it. So I had these long sheets, some of the sheets, this is very rare. I don't know if you can see what I'm showing you here, but very rare to get large sheets like this. But when I do, then I have the ability to at least do the first wrap. So this is actually 3 or 4 layers thick.
Do you make maquettes like a traditional sculptor would? Or
yes, yes, I use a mold, but then I have to change the mold. So I'm always adding and adding to the mold itself.
Yeah. Okay.
For each piece.
Okay, let's move on to the next one. And before we talk about it specifically, I just want to, when we see the next image, ask you, and I mean, this is just serendipitous, but I think this is a good place to do it, ask this question. Are there any contemporary sculptors or artists working in any medium that have affected you, that have sort of given you any kind of ideas about the direction you're currently taking?
I have to say no, because I actually haven't found anyone who's doing anything quite like this. Also, I have to confess that I'm self-taught, so my background is not as extensive as it might be that would lead me to research these kinds of things. Obviously, living in New York, I was in and out of the museums, but I can't say specifically
Okay.
that there is anyone. Can you? I mean, I would be grateful for.
Well, the one artist that as soon as when I first saw your work, the very first time I saw it, I thought of Eva Hesse.
Yes.
And of course, she used fabric and these kinds of fabrics. Her more signature use of this similar type of material, it would be suspended and it would be moved by any air currents in the ambient environment. So it's like you, but not like you. You're you know, and there were a lot of uses of materials in New York. Right. In the 60s and 70s, and now there's sort of a whole new resurgence of using sort of unconventional materials in contemporary art. But why don't you tell us a little bit about Artemis?
Well, Artemis, again, there's also sort of an impetus for things, but that the #MeToo movement swept through our culture. And frankly, I was affected by that too. So Artemis is the goddess of young women, the goddess of childbirth. And I loved the imagery of her as a hunter and a warrior and a protector. So that was this, just kind of spilled out of a notion of what she might look like in my fiber, in my way. So there are crystals, the spears and the feathers and the what do we call what the feathers are held in? I've just
shaft. The arrow
it's got
shaft.
another name. It's got another name where you keep spears and
the
arrows.
Quiver.
The quiver. Thank you. The quiver is exactly the same material as is the braided piece along the front. This is all the fiber
Okay.
So everything I always use is natural. These are just sticks that are holding the crystal and the feathers. So the idea of nature, of Artemis, of gods, of getting back to those values of protection,
Yeah.
protecting women, young women, just seemed so important at that time.
Yeah, and I have to say, as sometimes I do during these talks, because I'm an art historian and I can't avoid it, seeing it, this is to me very, very evocative of the classical imagery of Artemis, but it's almost pre-classical.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, because there's that brilliant white, but it's not finished marble, and it is more evocative of the original idea, as far back as I know it. I'm not a classicist, you know, of Artemis as the huntress and being in the woods, in nature.
Right.
So to me, this is a very compelling image, compelling work, perhaps in ways that you didn't think of or intend at all.
No, one thing that I did think of, it was the virginal aspect. So the white
Mhm.
was very important.
Yeah.
And it took me a while to find the whitest white of the
Yeah.
fiber, because you know, a lot of it is slightly yellowed, but this is just a beautiful white. And that, you know, to me is what she was.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Okay, I think we have 2 or 3 more, and I want to go ahead and get a good look at them so that we can open up for questions. This is absolutely fascinating to me because it's a tremendously evocative form, you know, or image, and I cannot figure out what it is.
It was a very large, 44 inches in every direction, ball that I formed around, to be perfectly honest, a beach ball. So when I was at the National Academy Art School for a short period of time, they allowed me to suspend it from a ball and tackle. Is that what it's called? Yeah, ball and tackle from the roof, and then I would lower it down to work on it and then raise it back up because it took up so much room. And then of course, it became very difficult to get it through the door. So this is an enormous.
How big is it? 36?
44, well, 50, I'm sorry, 54 across.
54.
But now when I compress the bottom, because I attached underneath, there is a very large root. And so the bottom is compressed to accommodate the root. But yes, it's a very, very large piece.
You know what I thought it was when I first saw the image? I thought it was a big puff ball that somehow you've been able to preserve.
It's huge. And funnily enough, inside the eggs, which are obviously made of mulberry, are mulberries, berries, dried berries, that you can actually eat from the mulberry tree. So, but this came from this whole perpetuity. I'm fascinated with genome study and stem cell research, and I don't know why, but the idea that my children were now in their 30s, and what was I passing on? What was, you know, what is in the DNA? And that's what this was, as part of the Cambion Forest series, which, you know, I know we have a couple of other shots we can talk about, but the whole idea of nesting and a cocoon and breaking out of a cocoon, and then, you know, what happens beyond that. So that's where this and a number of the other pieces like this come from, is just that idea.
On a whole other level, that all makes wonderful sense, and I think it's something that you can see just by looking and thinking about the piece you've created. But I'm not an intense fan, but I am a fan of science fiction.
Yes,
so there's that sort of slightly unnerving aspect, but at the same time, of all the works of yours that I have looked at, this is the one that I want to touch it. You know, well, and most of your work to me does not have that. It's very visual. I want to look at it, but this one I want to touch.
Or crawl inside. Yeah,
now,
the
now that is a thought.
There you well, You couldn't, but
No, yeah, that's
uh-huh.
true.
Well, but that is that whole essence of a
Yeah.
nest and a cocoon, and
Yeah.
you know, we all crave some of that feeling, I think. But the root in this, again, you know, is just part of that whole, the roots.
Yeah, it makes visual and intellectual or sense all together. That's impressive.
Oh, well, thank you. I thank you very much.
Let's see the next piece, Martha.
Oh yes.
Uh,
This piece actually hung in your gallery, which is how I came to know about you. I don't know, two years ago, perhaps, in your paper show. And this again is Cocoon, and inside this you can't see, but I've used in a number of other pieces the cocoon pods, the chrysalis, what is left after the silkworm has been spun out, and that is what is up inside that piece. And again, the branch material does go back to the Ikebana, but creating this forest, which I did, and it was in the studio, and the pictures are on the website, but creating this forest of cocoons and nests and trees, and it's all just part of the same story.
Mm-hmm. Well, I hope you'll appreciate knowing that the day that I walked in and saw it for the first time, there were a number of people already in the room, and they were, who is this Frances Wilson? And this is fascinating.
And what on earth is this?
No, it was, it was that kind of reaction that most of us as artists would want to know our work had, that people are thinking about it, talking about it, curious about it. So yeah, this is quite another compelling image, particularly presented like this against the black ground, so that it really vibrates visually. I think we have one more, don't we?
I think so.
Or is that the last one, Martha?
This,
I
believe this is the last one.
Yeah, there we go. Knowing now all the things that you shared with us, it makes it, on one level, I think, easier to understand this piece, but I want you to explain it to us, because again, here I'm seeing science fiction qualities in the last piece.
Well, we all bring something to
Yeah.
to everything. Have you read the Hidden Life of Trees?
No, but I'm familiar with it.
Wellenben. I can't pronounce his last name. Wellenben, I think. And again, this has to do with connectivity. So I have a few of these trees, and where you see at the base, the sort of spilling out, I can put these trees together. So you start to see the connective tissue. And it's not a coincidence that it looks a bit like a blood vessel. Mm-hmm. So The Hidden Life of Trees is really an amazing book that talks about how trees communicate one to the other through their root system. So it's that. I love that notion of spreading out.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I love the fact that you have the slender green shoots and green moss or whatever that is.
It's lichen.
Lichen. So there's that regeneration and resilience, as you title it, was to me the clue, in addition to the visual clue.
Well, that's very perceptive, because what is embedded in there, the lichen, and I'm sure that somebody in the audience will know exactly the number, but the lichen will live for thousands and thousands of years. I actually had a wonderful conversation with a biologist at MIT about the notion of lichen, because she was fascinated. I was concerned that, was I killing it? Would it last? What would happen to it over time? But she was just so enthusiastic about lichen itself. So it's a curious thing. I don't think it's living there any longer, I hate to say, but.
Well, okay, I am interested in this kind of thing, and as I often tell my family, my head's full of lots of bits of useless knowledge. Mm-hmm. I think that lichen goes dormant when you treat it like this, and if you haven't put chemicals on it that actually would kill it, I think you could put water on it and revive it.
Perhaps I can. I actually bought this. It's sold for toy train or electric train installations.
Yeah.
There's a number of wonderful preserved moss and things
Yeah.
that they,
That's great.
it's researching material.
Well, Frances, it's been wonderful talking with you and learning more about you as an individual and your work. But we've only given ourselves about 15 minutes for questions, and I'm sure there are some interesting questions out there. So let's go with questions.
If you don't want to talk, you're more than welcome to type it in the chat. And I see we have one from Malka. How do you secure the lichen onto your work?
Do I really have to answer that?
Not if it's a proprietary secret.
Crazy glue. I do believe I had to resort to the fine tip of crazy glue. However, most things I do secure using just the hardener that I use for everything else. Yeah.
Great. We have a question from Lauren who asks, how is your photography done? They also say it's very good.
Thank you. Now I because I don't have a studio any longer, I'm doing everything in my living room with my iPhone 12. It's very effective, I have to say. I put up the black, and I've tried with my assistant, tried to do and replicate with a regular camera, but I have to say, now that she's not here and I'm doing it on my own, it's the iPhone 12. Short answer.
Were any of the images we looked at today done on your phone?
I would say Poseidon, Artemis.
Wow.
I'm not sure. Yes, because I'd have to go back and look. But yes, those two were certainly done on my phone.
What kind of lighting do you use as a photographer? I'm curious about that.
Well, photography not being my background, I have to confess, I have this stand that has 3 little LED lights.
Oh.
Well, I'll send you the Amazon link. But I do use reflecting umbrellas.
Yeah.
But honestly, my technical skills in photography could do with a lot of.
Yeah, I play around with still life sometimes, and I haven't found a easy, inexpensive, and convenient lighting device. So I'm going to look into that.
I'm going to send it to you.
All right. Thank you. Okay.
Great.
Other questions?
We have one from a fellow Martha in the group chat. How do you model the torsos?
I use a mannequin. One thing that the hardener does not attach to plastics. So I have to be very careful when I build out the mannequin that it's all done with saran wrap and plastic molds and that kind of thing, because it needs about 36 hours generally to dry. So I have to have something that's secure and that I can release it from. That's often the hard part, is releasing it.
Do you ever have to like cut the piece off of the torso or however you've displayed it?
No, I design it so that it's enclosed on one side, but on the other side you can open it up to take it on and off a stand, and then it just closes back up.
And the hardener is a commercial product?
Well, I have had the good fortune of meeting a wonderful sculptor in Baltimore who has made the 2 stands that you had in your gallery there out of aluminum. But prior to that, I've been using acrylic, so a heavy 2-inch acrylic base and rod and shoulders. So, but the metal stand is beautiful. It's a piece of work in itself.
I'm sorry I'm asking so many technical questions.
No,
we usually try to like get into your philosophy, but I think you were very succinct on what you're talking about. And I'm also just curious about how you transport these pieces for exhibition.
Well, I had to ship Poseidon down to Florida a couple of weeks ago, and I found embroidery hoops that I attached all around the coral and its head. And then you know how dolls or toys are anchored to a piece of cardboard? That you punch holes in the cardboard and then you string through and tie it on the opposite side. That's how I do it.
Mm.
Cool. Yeah, I call it the Barbie doll packaging.
Yeah, well, as long as it works, it's there
It works.
safely and back.
It works. They're very light. I mean, none of them weigh more than maybe 7 or 8 pounds. So they're very light and very resilient. They're not fragile.
Oh, good. That's good to know, because I
No,
was
they're
always
not.
worried when I saw them in the gallery, somebody would bump
Yeah.
into them.
No, no. They're not the least bit fragile.
Oh, good. We're getting late in our hour, and I almost let you get by without what I thought
no.
was going to be my hardball question.
Uh-oh. Uh-oh.
Because your work is on one level so natural, you know, a natural material that you use, and many natural materials, do you think that it's a risk or a challenge to have your material seem so natural? Because I think it raises questions in the viewer's mind about how much control or how much manipulation goes into your process. I mean, is that a thought, a question that's ever occurred to you?
No, really, I think because I so love this material. I so love working with this material, and the challenge of making every piece just from this material has just been my own personal challenge.
Mm-hmm.
No, I suppose at some point I'll branch out. Sorry. To something else, but for now, I'm very happy doing this, particularly in that I have found how readily it dyes and takes beautiful, again, natural dyes. But if you see the orange behind me, I can, and the green is, I'm working on Athena at the moment. She's giving me some trouble. So the green there is part of Athena, and I'm still happy with the challenge.
Good.
So we'll see where that goes. I'm not sure I answered your question though.
No, there wasn't. No, the answer was whatever you said.
Oh.
Okay, well, I think we've, unless somebody has a question that they're pressing, you know, feel very much they want to ask, we'll go ahead and wrap up.
I see Chris's hand up. So Chris, if you want to unmute yourself.
Yeah, I'll ask a question that's maybe you don't have an answer to. I'm curious that I keep thinking of the phrase, the creation escapes the creator, in looking at your work, and it's some of the things that you've talked about and the images that you've done. Has there been an interpretation of one of your pieces that has surprised you, and what was it?
Oh, that's very interesting. Actually, I'm going to be very direct and say it was Martha's in the mailing that she did, because I was very pleased to see that it was the feminine aspect of my work that she responded to in the writing that she sent in the invitation, because I'm not conscious of that. Yes, Artemis was a very conscious piece, but I was curious. I think that's the most recent. I'm sure there's been others that I erased from my mind.
Well, I'm just going to jump in because Martha and I, in preparation, often talk about the artists that I'll be interviewing. And we both agreed that we were very interested in Frances's work and were impressed by it, but we never talked about it in any substantive way. And I too think that almost all of the work that I'm familiar with, Frances, I think of as feminine.
Yeah.
Even, you know, Poseidon, there's a real feminine element to it. So that's kind of interesting that a young woman and an old guy would sort of react in that similar way.
No, I appreciate that, because, you know, there's just always another way to look at something, another prism through which to look at something. So, and my 31-year-old daughter responded in the similar manner, I think, as Martha. So
Yeah. Well, just an interesting note then to end on. And thank you again, Frances. It's
My
been really
pleasure.
wonderful talking with you and getting to know you. And Martha, thank you for your help as usual.
course.
And thank
thank you,
all of our
Martha.
viewers and listeners for tuning in again. It's
you.
great to see so many familiar faces.
If I can plug real fast, we'll be having another Wil Talk on April 20th, and we'll be talking with MFA member Nadia Romanos Abizade, who is a graphic designer turned stoneware sculptor from Beirut, Lebanon. So that'll be interesting. It's always fun having sculptors. You guys are very tactile. That's fun.
Yeah.
So yeah, join us for that. Thank you.
Thank
Okay.
you. Thank
Thank
you,
you.
Martha.
Good night, everyone.
Thanks, Wil.